data ownership, I just want us to look at some key concepts of data protection. So, in the other video, we looked at data classification, but I also want, before we move on, to look at some key concepts in data protection. And we talk about them, but we didn't go in depth. So let's just look at some key concepts that will help us in the data that we talk about, which was data classification. We talk about sensitive information, internal, public, and confidential information. But before we move on, let's look at key concepts. We talk about, we made mention of encryption. And when we talk about encryption, we're talking about converting data into unreadable format to protect it from unauthorized individuals. So when we were talking about encryption and we said we must encrypt the data, we are basically saying that the data must be in an unreadable format to protect it from unauthorized users. If we protect our data, there is no way that unauthorized individual, if we encrypt it, that they can read whatever we encrypt. And when we talk about access control, as we talked about in the previous video, we said implement a role-based access and multi-factor authentication to restrict data access. And the reason we do this again is so that persons who are not authorized cannot get to the information. Encryption is a big thing in the cybersecurity world, right? It's a big thing. That's the reason we we really go towards protecting confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We encrypt it. We want to encrypt them. We want to hash them. We want to do whatever is necessary so the bad guy that is out there cannot gain access. Once they are the world of computer, there are always going to be some threat to the system. So access controls that key point is implementing role based. So if you are in accounting, you only get access based on your accounting role, right? So you only get access to account information, but you cannot get access to HR information. That's role based. And then you have to authenticate, something you are, something you know, somewhere you are, and something you have to authenticate you to get onto the system. And even when you're authenticate, you are restricted to certain limits. Access control. Data masking, right, is hiding data, right, to prevent it from being exposed in a non-secure environment. And sometimes when people take your credit card, one of the regulation is that the data have to be masked. Masking the data means they leave the four last digit, and example like credit card number, to prevent it from exposure. Sometimes they mask it so no one will be able to see the entire amount of number, or they replace it with some values, right? That is not the correct one. Backup and recovery, creating a secure copy of the data to recover from the system failure or cyber attack. That's another way to protect your data. Concept and regulation, we talk about that, and we said adhering to HIPAA and CCPA and GDPR. You're going to learn those as we go along. Okay, so these are just some additional information about data protection. There are scenarios, right? Data encryption in financial institution. So we're saying a bank store customers' financial record, including accounting numbers and transaction detail, on its internal database, right? To ensure data security, the bank encrypts all the data at rest in and in transit. However, an attacker gained access to an employee login credential through phishing. Because of the encryption, the attacker was unable to read any of the sensitive information. So that is quite important. We're going to come back up to those other rest of scenario, but those are very much important, right? So let's look at data ownership. When we talk about data ownership, right, we're talking about the responsibility and accountability assigned to an entity and individual department organization for the security and integrity and usage of the data. So if you are in development department, right, you are in ownership of the data that is given to you to develop a product. You are the owner of the data in that department. So it's a data ownership refers to the responsibility, the accountability assigned to an entity, an individual department, or organization for the security, integrity, and usage of the data. So if you are in ownership of the product department, the development department, those data are in your care. You are responsible for the information. You are responsible for the security of the information. You are responsible for the integrity of the information. That no one alters the information. That the information is properly secure. So is it that you going to ensure that IT does their part of the job, but however you're going to do it, you are responsible. You have ownership of the information, right? So let's go back up. So you have ownership of that information, and you must ensure that you as a controller determine the purpose, the means of processing that information. So you have data controller, data subject, the individual whose personal data is being processed, right? And you have the data processor, processes data on behalf of a data controller following their instruction. So you have the data controller determining the purpose and the means of processing personal data, right? You have data subject, the individual whose personal data is being processed, and you have the data processor. The processor, you're processing the data on behalf of the data controller, right? So let's say that I own the trade right to a particular development. I am the controller of all the secret to that. And then I decide that I'm going to give my information to a development person to develop the entire. You are processing on behalf of me, right? So those are the data processor and data controller. You are processing the data on behalf of me. Remember, we said that data is the ownership of the data is in the hands of an individual or entity, right? So data owner has ultimate authority over the data usage and classification. So they are the ones that can say my data is highly sensitive, confidential, internal, or it's public, right? So you have, these are roles in data ownership. Data custodian, they manages and protect the data according to the owner's policy, right? Data users, employees and systems that access and use the data. So roles in data ownership, they have the data owner, they have the ownership, like I have the ownership over my product. And then you have the custodian, is the person who protect the data according to the owner policy. So I tell you what must do, encrypt my data, do this. I tell you, I instruct you. So I am the owner and you are the custodian. And the people who are going to use the data, the employees and the systems, right? So responsibility of data owners, defining data classification level. So as the owner of the data, so you are going to define the data classification levels, right? establishing access control policy, ensuring compliance with regulatory standards, approving data and sharing use and share and use requests. So if you are working in an organization and you are processing data, or you are the owner of the data, you're going to define the data classification level. And what are data classification level? We spoke about that earlier. That data classification level has to do with whether it's confidential, internal, public, or whether those information are highly sensitive. So you are now, as the owner of the data, whether it's in the dev department or the development department, you are given the data to take control of the data. You are in custody of the data, right? Or as the owner of my data, I can tell who must have access to that. I implement policy that custodian probably have to follow. Probably users have to follow, right? So ensuring compliance and regulatory standard. Those are the owner of the data responsibility. Approve data sharing and usage requests. So the owner put all of these in place. Sometimes, or it probably go and can go, is as the owner, I give that information to the processor, and the processor implement my policy as the owner, or the custodian implement my policy that I give, right? So data ownership, we said we talk about that. We talk about the controller. Why am I going back up? So let's look at a little scenario here on a data ownership. Let me see if I have. So do you understand those concepts? Of the entire data ownership in an organization, that people just don't create information and they just let loose and anybody have access to them. Let's look at a data ownership for a broader understanding and to reinforce learning. A hospital medical record access control. A hospital's IT department manages an electronic medical record system where patient health records are stored, right? The chief medical officer is designated as the data owner, responsible for defining who can access, edit, and share patient data. The IT security team, acting as the data custodian, ensure the data is encrypted and protected from breaches. Meanwhile, doctors and nurses categorized as data users access the record for patient care, right? One day, a researcher team requests access to the patient data for a study, right? The request is forwarded to the CMO, which is a chief medical officer, who reviews the compliance implications and grant approve under strict condition. All right, so let's look at this scenario for a minute. The hospital IT department manage electronic medical record system where the patient healthcare records are stored. The chief medical officer is designated as the owner of the information. And she's responsible, or he, to defining who can gain access, who can edit, who can share the data. Right? So They determine who gets hands on this information, who can edit the information. And so that's why in organization we have different kind of restrict permissions. Edit, execute, or you get all privilege. Or read, write, and execute only. We are given permissions. And then the next step is access. So she determined who will gain access, who can edit, and who can share. So maybe the policy is that anyone that wants data for study or anything, the policy could be let it come back to me as a chief medical officer. No one else have that authority because the chief medical officer is the owner. The IT security department act as the data custodian. So the chief medical officer give over the information to IT as a custodian. They ensure the data is encrypted and protected from breaches, right? So that's why they give the information, they give HR department, the IT department rather, sorry, not HR, the hospitality IT department, because they are the one that have the technical expertise to protect, to encrypt the data from breaches. While the doctors and the nurses, they are using these information, gaining access to this information for patient care because they got to know what medication the patient took yesterday, what's the patient problem, what's the patient history. So the people that uses these data on a day-to-day basis are the nurses and the doctors. The person who protect them from unauthorized individual and to encrypt them is the IT, which is the custodian. The owner of the information is the chief medical officer. The users of this information are the doctors and the nurses. So somebody come one day and said, I want to do a study and I need some data for that study. The IT department have to send that information now to the CMO. And the CMO will determine if they will give access to the information. Do you understand this whole aspect of data ownership? The owner, the custodians, and the users. If you're not understanding, you could always reach out to me and let me know you're not understanding, and I will take another route to make sure that you understand. So custodian, the person who is given charge of the data. The owner is a chief controller. The data belong to them. And then they can use processors or different terminologies as you see it. That's what I was doing not long ago. You have the processors and you have the other persons who are um, the the chief. Let me show you the data controller, data processor, and data subject, right? So let's look at another scenario. A university professor leads a research project on artificial intelligence. As the data owner, the professor determined who can use the research database under what condition. The university IT team, acting as the data custodian, ensuring the research data is securely stored in compliance with the institution policy. Graduate student working on the project, the data user, requests permission to download the data for analysis, to analysis, right? The professors as the owner review their requests and grant access, but only after ensuring they complete a data security training course. Okay? So look at this scenario. Do you see who is the owner? The professor is the owner. The university professor leads the security research project in artificial as a data owner. So he's leading it, he's the owner. The owner determine who gain access, under what condition would they gain access, and so forth and so on. Now, since the owner of the data cannot encrypt or anything of that, they give it over to the IT, which are their custodians, right? And the IT department is the one that is going to put the information in, make it secure, right? They make the information. Now, anybody that's studying and want access to those are the data users, right? So it's important that information at every level of an organization is protected and there's somebody that is responsible, because the original owner, unless you are an individual owning your company, but once it is a large corporation, you need to delegate, right? And you need the IT department, and you need people that are going to be using your information that will gain access, and you need to restrict who can gain access and who cannot gain access. Let's look at another one, a financial data ownership in a bank. A major bank collects and process customer financial data, including account balances and transaction history. The chief financial officer serves as the data owner, setting policies on how this data should be stored and accessed. The IT department, acting as a data custodian, enforce encryption, backup procedure, cybersecurity measure to protect the data. An employee in the customer service department, the data user, tries to access high value client account without authorization. The custodian monitoring the system flags this activity, and the CFO, as the chief financial officer, as the owner, decide to revoke the employee access and investigate the breach. You see that? Because not only are the custodian, the IT department is encrypting, but they also have backup and they also have security measure to protect the data, so they can be alerted of whoever is trying to access this information without authorization. Do you see that? What are your thoughts? You can write them down and send them to me. So it's interesting because why it went to the CFO, because the CFO is the one who made the policy of what should happen should anyone gain unauthorized access. So that's why it went back. They are the owner of the data. They are in charge of the data. They may not be the one that comes up with the idea, but they are the one that is given charge, and then they dedicate it to IT, and then the people that must use it, it goes to them. So IT responsibility as a custodian is to ensure that the information is protected. Data are very sensitive. Data are very crucial to the livelihood of an organization. And if you are given custody of information as a cybersecurity personnel, whatever department you're working in, you have to ensure that the data is protected by all means. Data cannot just be let loose in the hands of anybody, because company's reputation is on the line. The possibility of getting a breach is on the line. As custodian, you are responsible for all the information that is in your hands. You are responsible for the information. Is that clear? So let's look at some multiple choice questions. Who is responsible for defining data classification levels and access policy? Is it the data user, the data custodian, the data owner, IT, security analysis? And we know that the answer is data owner. And we talk about data ownership, and we say the person who is responsible for the data is the data owner. We said the data users are the people that will be handling the information, and the custodian are the person who the data owner gave responsibility for safekeeping and encrypting. Which of the following best describe the role of a data custodian? Do you remember what I said? A data custodians are or is? A, define access control policy for data. B, managing and protecting data based on policies set by the data owner. C, using data for daily businesses operations. D, making financial decisions on how data is used within an organization. So we know that data custodians, they manage data and protected data based on policies set by the data owner. So that's all the custodians are doing. They are managing and protecting the data based on a policy that is set by the data owner. So if the data owner said, if you as a cyber security person, you go into an organization, and the data owner who hires you, who owns the data, said to you, make sure that all employees only have role-based access. And when we talk about role-based access, let us quickly run up to this scenario of a role-based access so I can give you. So this is a role-based access control that as a custodian, you might be told by the owner of the data that you must only give role-based access to the information. So let's look at this. An hospital has an electronic medical record system where different staff members require different level of access. Doctors can view and update patient records. Nurses can view records but cannot modify them, and administrative staff can only access billing details. Do you see that? So that's one of the job of the custodian that the owner will tell them to do. Listen, only give role-based access, right? Restrict the access. So they only have role-based access and nothing at all. So this is what we're talking about: managing and protecting data based on the owner's policies based on the policies set by the data owner. So organization, the owner, the top man, is going to tell the custodian, the person who is giving the information to protect, give them role base, restrict their access, restrict their permission, right? Are we understanding that? Any question? This is very good because you know you're going to understand exactly this whole data, um, why data is so important, why there's a fight to protect, why people don't want to share certain secret, why do they give you a non-disclosure policy to sign? You know why? Because data is important. Data can cost the company their entire financial reputation, their entire finance. They can cost you. Okay, which role primarily use data but does not have authority over access policy? Data custodian, data owner, data user, chief information security officer. So the person is the data user, right? The data user can The data user have access to the data, but they don't have authority over access policy, right? So nobody can come to any member in the organization and ask, can I get some data for research? And as a user, you processing you are part of the process, and you decide that you're going to give it. You don't have that authority. You don't, right? What is one of the key responsibility of a data owner? You as a data owner, you have some responsibility, and we spoke about those responsibilities. We talk about them, right? So let's run back up and see what we spoke about in terms of the data owner responsibility. Data responsibility of the data owners. So some of the responsibility is defining the data classification level. Remember we talk about that? Establishing access control policies. Remember we talk about that? Ensuring compliance with regulatory standards, approving data sharing and usage requests. So you have a responsibility. So let's run back down the street and look at this. What is one of the key responsibility of a data owner? Backing up and restoring data, defining who have access to the data and how it should be used, monitoring network traffic for security threats, ensuring legal action against data misuse. So one of the responsibility as you as a data owner is to define who have access to the data and how it should be used. Because it's yours. All right, so when you buy a book and you said all right reserved, nobody should replicate this book without our permission. You are actually giving a restriction over your data, your information that is in that book, right? So you are saying, I am giving, making it public, but I am also giving it some level of restriction as to what you can do with this book thereafter. Because I'm the owner, right, of the book. Do you understand that concept? Anyone? Is there any? Okay, so which of the following is not a responsibility of a data owner? As a data owner, what is not your responsibility? Approving data shared requests, implementing technical security control, establishing compliance policies, defining data classification levels. And we said implementing technical security control. We give those to the custodians, the IT department, the one that's going to protect. Because not because I own the data mean that I know what security policies to implement to protect the data, right? So we have to find a way, find a custodian to give the data to so they can protect the data, right? 6. Hospital medical director ensure a hospital medical director ensures that patient records are properly classified and only accessed by authorized personnel. What role does the medical director serve in data governance? So again, a hospital medical director ensure that patient records are properly classified and only accessed by authorized personnel. What role does the medical director serve in the data governance? Data user, data custodian, data owner, IT administrator. And we would say that is the data owner. She's the owner of the data. She's the director of the hospital, the director of the patient record. So she's the owner of the data. So she again went to determine who have access to it, how it is used, and the policies and the procedure that the custodian must follow for this information to be kept secured. Number 7, what is the primary role of a data user? the nurses and the doctors? What are their the customers, the employees, not the customer, the employees? What are their role as the data users? Defining the security policies for the data storage, protecting data by implementing cybersecurity controls, accessing and using data without permitted guidance, configuring firewalls and encryption for sensitive data. So we are saying access and using data within the permitted guidelines. They can determine that. Okay, they can't. As a data user, you don't make policies and you don't determine certain levels of what information must be used for. A company's cybersecurity team is responsible for encrypting stored data and ensuring backup are secure. What role this team play? A company's security team is responsible for ensuring encrypting stored data and ensuring backups are secure. What role does this team play? Data owner, data user, data custodian, data compliance. So remember, they have the responsibility of encrypting, so they got to be the custodian, right? They are the ones that are doing the backup. What happens if data owner fails to define a proper access control policy? What happens if the owner of the data fails to implement policies, access control policies? This is a detrimental situation, dangerous. The organization will have enhanced security. Data may be accessed by unauthorized individual leading to a breach. Data will automatically be protected by default security measure. The IT department will assume ownership of all company data. So what is going to happen, because nobody can override the owner of the data and you cannot implement anything above the owner of the data. So the data will be accessed by unauthorized individual and it will lead to a breach. And that is disastrous. Because remember, if the owner don't implement any policy, there is no way you as the custodian, as a custodian, or you may be an IT personnel, or you cannot implement anything above the owner, right? Who is ultimately accountable for ensuring data is handled in compliance with legal and regulatory requirements? Who is responsible for ensuring that the data is handled in compliance with legal and regulatory requirement? The data user, the data owner, the data custodian, the IT staff, IT support staff. The owner determines that the data is theirs and they determine who have that level of access to the data. So for recap, we look at data ownership, right? We're looking at data ownership. We looked at data ownership. For recap, just to make sure that you have a understanding of what we just did. We looked at data ownership. We talk about data ownership. We said that data ownership, you have a data controller, the data subject, or you have the data processor. We have different names for them, right? So we said we talk about data, and we said data the data ownership is responsible for accountability assigned to an entity. So they have a responsibility. In other words, an individual or entity have a responsibility for the security and the integrity and the usage of the data, right? So they try. And we said the roles in data ownership, data owner has the authority over the data and how it is classified. And we talk about that data custodian manages and they protect the data according to the owner's policy. We looked at that, okay? And we said data users, these are employees, and these are systems that have access and use the data, okay? So we have roles in data ownership. And we said we talk about the responsibility of the data owners, and we said they must define the data classification level. We said they must establish access control policy. We said they must ensure compliance with regulatory standard, and we said they are the ones that approve data sharing and usage requests. And we look at some scenarios of data ownerships, right? And we look at who are the owners and who are the custodians and who are the users in different scenarios. And we also looked at some multiple choice question that helps us to reinforce what we have learned. Okay, so I'm going to pause.